Tonight we have with us Moon Duchin and Liz Kopecki from the MGGG Redistricting Lab out of Tufts University. And I will let them tell you all about themselves. Thanks for joining us.
All right. Hi, everybody. We're happy to be here. I'm Moon, as you heard, professor of math at Tufts University, and run a lab called the MGGG Redistricting Lab. These days we're about 12 people, depending on how you count, a mix of postdocs, grad students, undergrads, and research staff. And we bring together expertise in math, computing, geography, policy, and outreach. And we're working on a number of projects that try to make what I like to call computational interventions in redistricting. So we're really excited to talk to you about one of our software projects tonight called Districtr, and I'll just throw into the chat the URL so you can click that link and check it out. And what you'll see when you go in there, and we'll go through this and show you in a bit, there are landing pages for every state, plus Puerto Rico and DC, that let you kind of look at different scales of redistricting, and you can draw the districts yourself. But today we want to focus on a second tool, which is a community drawing tool. And so that's meant to get at this idea of communities of interest, which are so important in redistricting. And so my colleague Liz here, who I hope will introduce herself in a sec, also has a slide deck that we'll use just to tell you a little bit about the big picture before we demo the tool.
All right, let me share my screen. And in the meantime, my name is Liz, and I work as a project manager at the lab. And I run a lot of the point for our Districtr tool. And this is a presentation about how to map communities in Districtr. And this image over here on the right is a screenshot from my browser when I went into Districtr and tried to map where I grew up in Illinois. So what is Districtr? It's a free public web tool for state legislatures, commissions, and community organizers. It was developed by our team at the Tisch College of Civic Life at Tufts University. And as Moon mentioned, we're a research lab of mathematicians, data scientists, software developers, geographers, outreach specialists, and volunteers committed to fair and open redistricting. And our goal was to create this mapping tool to ask the community what matters in a process that usually happens behind closed doors. So over the past year, we've been partnering with good government organizations and civil rights groups to customize and make the tool as user-friendly as possible. Districtr isn't the only mapping software that does this. So over the past year, we've also given a lot of thought about how to be interoperable with the other softwares out there.
Yeah, and I'll just add, so I personally got into redistricting full-time, one might say obsessively, in 2016 when I was teaching a class on the theory of voting, social choice theory. And since my math specialty is in geometry or shapes, I got really interested first in some of the rules around redistricting that have to do with the shapes of districts. And that's one of a suite of traditional principles that are brought to bear on deciding when districts are acceptable, when districts are good. And as I got deeper into it, one of the things that I learned is that the least precise and therefore the least often used of those common traditional rules is keeping communities intact. So this is an intervention that's meant to close the gap between how people think about where they live, what folks have in common and their needs, their representational needs in government, the gap between thinking about it and making it visible to the folks who are drawing the lines.
Okay,
so question. Question is the Redistricting Commission open to various mapping tools, not locked into any specific packages? And so there, let me distinguish. Usually when a Redistricting Commission selects an official software package, it's for drawing the districting lines. And so I believe in Virginia, the selection has been made to use software called Citygate for drawing the lines. This is a different question. And as you're about to hear from Liz, line drawing and community identification are related but distinct. And so Virginia does not yet have any mechanism in place for officially collecting community input for the commission's consideration. And that's what we want to address.
Cool. Yeah, so the next slide will talk a little bit more about the communities tool itself, but first I want to point out the districting tool that we have. So this is a screenshot from Districtr. Once you're at the homepage, you can navigate to your state. So this is a screenshot of the Virginia homepage. And here you can choose to do one of two things. You can draw districts if you follow this purple path. And you'll see you can either draw 11 congressional districts, 40 state senate districts, or 100 districts for the House of Delegates. And so if you click on one of those, you'll go to a map where you can start drawing, and you'll be prompted to draw districts of roughly equal population. And you'll see here you can toggle between state and city, and that's just another option that we have. We make a lot of local modules for drawing districts in city councils and county commissions or school districts as well.
Yeah, and to that point, I'll just say often we make those modules by request. So you'll see if you go into Districtr later, and I hope that you will, that right now the only Virginia city that is spotlighted here is Virginia Beach. And that's because some local organizers in Virginia Beach reached out and told us they'd like to see what it would look like to draw districts in the city. So if you have any other spot, a county or a city in Virginia where you'd like to see a local redistricting module, we take requests to set something up on a custom basis for your locality.
Yeah, so if you click over to the community side, you see all these red buttons appear. And this is where you can access the community tool to start drawing communities of interest. And we're going to go over the exact legal definition in Virginia in the next few slides. But you can start thinking about this as your neighborhood.
A quick note here, you'll notice that you have a choice to identify a community built out of block groups or out of precincts. And so just a quick thing to highlight, that's a choice based on what kind of data layers you'd like to be able to see. So block groups are census geography. And so you can see all kinds of data on race and ethnicity that's collected by the census if you go into block groups. It's also on a block group basis, you can attach all kinds of other socioeconomic data from the American Community Survey. So you'd be able to see, who owns a car, who owns versus rents their home, and so on. That's data that we can attach to block groups. On the other hand, precincts are electoral administrative geography. So if you want to see recent election results and so how many people voted for this candidate versus that, you'd want to go into the precinct side because electoral data is attached to precincts.
Yeah, it's really interesting once you start playing and mapping your community to kind of see what kind of data is there. But so how can this help in Virginia? The new commission has to hold 3 public meetings in different parts of the state to collect public testimony, and they have to prepare a plan that preserves communities of interest. This is in quotations because this is criteria that's challenging to follow if you don't know exactly where the boundaries and the communities are. So we recommend using public mapping tools like Districtr to collect public input through public mapping. And with Districtr, you can share your boundaries, you can mark important places, and you can tell narratives or share narratives to tell a personal story. And we think that this kind of public input can increase engagement, but also add legitimacy to the process if you can reach across the state and hear from diverse voices.
Yeah, so what I would add here is, Virginia is one of a handful of states that have moved to a commission model in the last few years. Joining, for instance, Michigan and Ohio and Colorado. There, voter referenda in Missouri and Utah did pass redistricting commissions back in 2018, but that got kind of overturned in a backlash before it could be implemented. So what's interesting, there's a real opportunity here to kind of rethink best practices for drawing the lines. And in particular, we think that there's a real opening to take communities of interest seriously. And so the idea here is that frequently when there are rules like this new commission has to hold at least 3 public meetings, in past cycles, that's ended up being a little bit pro forma. You'll hold hearings, people will come, they'll tell you in sometimes impassioned narratives about kind of where they live and what's important. But there's a gap, right? There's been a problem rendering that as spatial data on a map so that it can be really like observed alongside the other more precise redistricting principles and rules. So the idea here is, your commission itself is seeking diversity on the commission. But more than that, there's so many different kinds of people across the state. Public input is a real way to hear from more voices if it's done right. And so we would like to be part of a, kind of tapestry of lots of groups that are making free software available and that are making person power available to help you recruit others in your communities and beyond to do their own mapping. Liz, you can go ahead and advance the slide. There's a question in the chat. Is Citygate the only platform available? Right, so this is an interesting point. So Citygate will be what the mapping consultant uses to draw the new plan, right? But what's true in Virginia, and it'll be true across the whole country, not just in the commission states, is that in this cycle, more than ever before, the public is also going to be drawing, right? It's now easier to do than that ever has been in the past. And so we think actually in all the states, because every state redistricts, even if you only have 1 congressional district, there's still legislative lines to be redrawn and on down. We think that all states are going to see submissions in map form for the first time and not only in narrative form. And so actually, and we'll talk about this a little more as we go, a big question that we hear as we go around and talk to folks from different states about this process is, so you collect all these maps, then what, right? There are ways that having kind of too much data is just as problematic as having too little. So before we wrap up, we hope to talk about how to summarize all of that input into something actionable. Liz?
Yeah, so backing up to what the definition of a COI is in Virginia, it is a neighborhood or any geographically defined group of people living in an area who share similar social, cultural, and economic interests. And then in talking to some people in Virginia, we've tried to put together some potential COIs, which we think could be coastal communities in Virginia Beach that rely on tourism, chicken farmers on the Eastern Shore, commuters in Loudoun County who rely on the same infrastructure if they commute to DC, towns near the Blue Ridge Mountains with unique environmental concerns, and residential communities that are tied to the University of Virginia.
The list goes on. And something that's important to think about here is many of these are tied to a kind of either a shared industry or to a shared infrastructural need. But there are so many more permutations and possibilities to consider about what might give a group a kind of need for a voice in government. And sometimes, as we'll show you when we look at kind of drawing the map, a question to ask yourself is, what's a need that folks are having trouble getting a response to? That's usually a pretty good prompt to think about what it is that might define a community of interest. I'll say just a little bit more for this slide, which is there is a reasonable amount of case law around what courts have considered to rise to the level of a kind of permissible community of interest for redistricting purposes. And so I'll just mention courts have smiled on socioeconomic commonalities. They've been more mixed on the question of whether religious commonalities can count. There's cases in both directions. Courts have accepted common health concerns, such as a cancer cluster, but have definitively shied away from just race alone being a thing that sort of counts as a legitimate COI. The Voting Rights Act is a separate provision on the basis of race. But for COI, we usually kind of try to help people when they draw move beyond simple party or race commonalities to talk about what the underlying interests are. So some of the prompts that you can ask to get a little bit past race and party are, well, if there's a community meeting in your area, what might it be about, right? Or if there are protests in your area, what might they be about? And this is a way to sort of get past party and race as a surface level description of commonality and get to the interests that are shared. Comment in the chat. Districts shall be drawn to preserve communities of interest. A neighborhood or any geographically defined group of people living in an area who share similar social, cultural, and economic interests. Does not include political affiliation or political party. Great. I think that's pretty well reflected in the comments that I was just making. Thank you.
Whoops, I went too far. Okay, so this is a map that we borrowed from Bostonography, which asked people to draw the different neighborhoods of Boston. And we think this is the kind of thing you could see when you go out and ask a lot of different people to map their community. This map, the dark areas, show areas of consensus where people agreed on where exactly the neighborhood is. And then the lighter areas are kind of on the fringe, not necessarily everyone agrees on that spot. I just personally really like this map because it shows how many unique experiences and different input you might get if you go out and start asking people where their community or neighborhood is.
Yeah, it's a great reminder that the on the ground concept of community is fuzzy edged, right? If you ask a number of different people to map South Boston, which is one of the neighborhoods that features on this map, they'll give you slightly different definitions of kind of vernacular Southie, right? And from our point of view, that's good. We're not looking for the correct boundaries. We're looking for sort of the understood lived reality, the sort of what's the extension of the shared identity. And so we know that's necessarily going to be fuzzy edge. So this gets to the point that I raised earlier. After you do a lot of collection, you need to do summarization, right? Summarization is necessary to fuse, maybe you get 3,000 different maps into something that you can kind of see in capsule view. So that's where a lot of data science techniques kind of come to bear, taking clusters of keywords and sort of seeing if they occur in spatially coherent patterns, right? And that's how you're able to take lots of different, this map is doing something a little simpler than the COI task. It's just taking named communities and asking people where they are. In our case, we'll need to take kind of a consensus view of not only named communities, but kind of the keywords that make them cohere, right? So it's an interesting challenge and one that like our data scientists are sharpening their knives for.
Before we actually get into the demo of Districtr, we wanted to show a few places where it's actually been used locally. So the first example is the city of Napa, California. They were moving to districted elections and they put a link to Districtr on their website. This is kind of a fun example because this is something we only recently learned that they had done. So it's kind of nice to know that someone can request a module, and then once it's out in the public, anyone can use it to submit maps. And so ultimately, people in the community we had heard painted their districts in Districtr, printed and signed, and then submitted their maps as public comment. I think others had also emailed a link to their map as a submission, but there's a couple ways to export and share what you've done in Districtr.
Right. So what that speaks to is kind of a key question. So, a lot of folks you'll notice in the chat have already been asking, but what's the official software? And I think that part of the point we're trying to make is that in this cycle, input is going to be top down and bottom up, right? It's going to be coming from, official sources like a submission portal set up by the state in some states, but it's just going to be circulating in a grassroots way in other cases. And what we think of as our mandate here is to be able to take both top down and bottom up submissions into account, right? Buzzy asked a question in the chat. In the software, can you put in negative criteria such as don't split precincts and still save communities of interest? So our software is letting you do two things: draw communities and draw districts. And then what we've been kind of sketching for you is a process after a lot of communities have been collected, a process to summarize them and present a shapefile to the line drawers. Now, will the line drawers have to take that into account together with all kinds of other criteria? Absolutely. So don't split precincts, don't split counties, make sure you're preserving opportunity to elect under the VRA, because that's your, that's in fact required of all states still until the Supreme Court gets another crack at it, right? The folks doing the district drawing are going to have to take all these things into account simultaneously. Now, does Districtr itself let you take them into account? Well, we let you do two things. One, you can choose your base units. Like I showed you before, you had a choice between block groups and precincts, and you can request other base units if you'd like for a particular module. We also, in all of our modules, and I'll show you this later when we demo, we show you county lines, and we let you draw with whole counties before you start refining to balance population. So that's some of the, we made a design choice. Actually, this is kind of important, I think. We made a design choice when designing Districtr to not take the criteria and the scores and the metrics and make the experience primarily about those. We wanted a more holistic, more accessible drawing experience that's distinct from, at the end, the legal validity of a final plan, right? So there are, in Districtr, under the hood, there's the opportunity to see a lot of the other criteria. For instance, you can check that your districts are contiguous. We have a feature to do that. But it's a little bit buried in the interface because we don't want the legal rules to be foremost in your mind. We want people to sort of talk holistically about community and not worry first and foremost about the, Polsby-Popper score or what have you. Right, so the other example that Liz flags on this slide here is the city of Lowell. So just be really brief about Lowell. That's a town, it's a city just up the road from Tufts that was recently sued under the VRA by a coalition of Asian and Latino plaintiffs who made up 40% of the city, but had never or almost never been represented on the city council. And as part of the consent decree around that lawsuit, voters got to choose between a districted system and an alternative ranked choice voting system. And they chose districts. So now a special master, law professor from Stanford, has been brought in to draw districts in Lowell for the first time. And we were part of a kind of grassroots effort to collect community input about what was important for that line drawer to know. And what we heard when we talked to folks was that a certain neighborhood called the Acre was a point of entry community for a lot of different kinds of immigrants, really important working class identity for the city, but had literally never sent a representative to the city council. While another neighborhood called Belvedere was so overrepresented on the city council that it sometimes had more than 2/3 of the seats, right? And so when we asked people, okay, where is the Acre? Where is Belvedere? We got some interestingly different answers. And so one thing that we did was we looked at the real estate definition of Belvedere. We looked at the official city map of neighborhoods definition of Belvedere. And then we looked at the Belvedere we collected from folks. And we found that they didn't have the same shape. Vernacular Belvedere was bigger, it included more areas. And not only that, but when we collected it, we were able to get a whole list of keywords of what people thought made Belvedere Belvedere, right? And so this is the kind of example of texture that you can get from a mapping tool that pairs spatiality with narrative. Right. Maybe we'll move sort of quickly through this one, but I'm really interested. I used to live in Chicago. I was a graduate student there. And that's a city where our group did a really in-depth mapping project a few years ago, trying to understand how that city council has evolved and maybe could be reformed. So I'll be brief, but the Chicago City Council has 50 seats. And, you know, historically, Chicago's had, of course, as those of you who've spent any time there know, really important Black population concentrated on the south side of the city. And so those 50 seats, the question has been historically, how many Black seats and how many white seats, right? With a rising Latino population in Chicago, the question becomes every time the lines are redrawn, should we draw Latino seats? And then whose seats should that take away from? Should that diminish the number of Black seats or the number of white seats? I respectfully submit to you, this is not a really great community-focused way to think about what it is to draw a responsive good government districting plan. So what the COI point of view can do is reframe these questions away from race and to shared interests. So we at MGGG, we work closely with a sociologist named Robert Vargas, based at UChicago. And Robert's done some fascinating work on the Little Village neighborhood, which is on the west side of the city. That's a heavily Latino neighborhood. But more than that, what Little Village has in common, among other things, is a really intense history of street violence. The bottom map there is a map of different gang territories that overlap the neighborhood. And on top, what you see is the aldermanic wards, the city council wards. And you see they slice kind of irrationally through the neighborhood and they cut it into small pieces. What's actually particularly important here isn't just that Little Village is cut three ways, but that Little Village makes up a relatively small part of each of those districts, meaning that it's hard for the folks in the neighborhood to have a real voice in the city council. And they've tried. They've gone to their alder people and they've asked repeatedly, for instance, for cameras to help lessen the street violence problem that they have. But those aldermen will say, well, I've only got so much money and it has to go for all of my constituency. Sorry, it doesn't rate, right? So that's a really clear problem where the shared interest can be made very concrete and can sort of reframe how we think about shifting districts in Chicago over time to be responsive to the needs of the residents.
Cool. I'm gonna stop my share now. That's the end of the slides. When do you want to share district?
Sure. This might be a good moment before I switch to a demo to ask if folks have any questions. All right. So let me share my screen. And we'll do a little bit of mapping. All right, so here's the Districtr front page. And here's the 50 states plus Puerto Rico and DC where I can do redistricting. And what I'm going to do is a little bit of mapping near where I live in Cambridge. So you can see I have a choice. I can build from block groups, towns, precincts from the census cycle post 2000 or post 2010, right? I'm going to go with block groups. And let's take a look. So once this loads, what you'll see is that we use a platform called Mapbox, which looks a lot like the kind of maps you might have on your smartphone. So it should look pretty familiar and comfortable. And as I zoom in, I can start to see more detail. Now, if I want to go near where I live, I can put my address in. And let it take its time trying to find me. And here we are in Cambridge. Okay. So zooming out a bit, I start to see the names of different businesses in my neighborhood. And I can tell you that when folks ask me where I live, I tell them I live in Huron Village. Okay, so what do I have in mind when I think about my vernacular understanding of my neighborhood? So here's my own block group. And then I would like to draw this way and this way and this way. And maybe we could go and take Fresh Pond and include it. Okay, so I'm going to call this Huron Village. In fact, I'll probably go a little more here and here. But as you see, this is not an exact science, and that's the point, right? So this is Huron Village as I think about it today. And I can tell you, what does it have in common? It's mixed residential, commercial buildings. It's high walkability. It's families and schools. It's heavy on the NIMBYs, which I'm sure we all know, not in my backyard. My neighborhood's big on that. If I think about things that community meetings might be about here, they might certainly be about, the NIMBYism captures the fact that community meetings might include plans for new land use. That would be a big, we get flyers about that all the time in the neighborhood. Also about the bus lines. So bus service has been cut in the last few years. This is an issue because we're not that close to the subway in this neighborhood, so we need the buses to connect us to kind of get around greater Boston area. Okay, we can stop there. And then this software lets us add more communities. And so I could name other areas near me and try to say what they might have in common with mine or what might be a little bit different. And so, for example, if I go drawing up this way, this is a neighborhood. You'll notice that I can let communities overlap. This is an important difference to districts, right? Districts need to be equipopulous and non-overlapping and totally cover the jurisdiction, but communities can and do overlap. I might have some block groups that are in more than one. So what's in yellow we might call North Cambridge. And moving into North Cambridge, we see much more racial diversity. This is at least my vernacular understanding. By the way, when I have done experiments kind of talking people through mapping their communities, sometimes I'll start asking questions and they'll say, wait, can I go look it up? And what I try to emphasize to folks is that you don't have to be right. Like there's not kind of a quiz at the end of this process. This is about people describing what they think that the concerns are that animate folks on the ground. So in North Cambridge, there's a lot of debate about kind of, new buildings and then affordable housing policy. And I can stop there for now. Let me show you then what you can do once you've started naming communities. You can flip over to the evaluation tab and take a look at how, in this case, the demographics of each community that you've identified compared to the state as a whole. So you can see that Huron Village, where I live, is a little bit whiter than the state as a whole, but has a non-trivial Asian population. And when I flip over to North Cambridge, the demographics change a little bit, and I see a lot more Black population in particular. Okay, which kind of fits with my vernacular sense of what the neighborhoods are like. Okay. If I go to data layers, I can turn off the communities that I've been drawing, and I can change scale. I can zoom way out and start to see the different counties. And that might show me, Massachusetts is a state that has only 14 counties. Counties are big and they don't have a whole lot of identity. In fact, I confidently predict if you ask most folks in Cambridge what county they're in, they couldn't name it. And that's something that we find varies really around the country very much. In some states like Texas, your county is a really important part of your civic identity, right? And in some states like Pennsylvania, it depends. If you live in Montgomery County, you certainly know it, but that might not be the case if you live out in the center of the state. Okay, another feature that I'd like to highlight is the ability to show not only to paint regions that describe a location, but also to show kind of landmarks of interest. And so that's visible in this important places or a landmark tool that would let me put someplace in that's pretty important. And so for instance, I could put in Cambridge Common. Actually, I wanted the park, not the restaurant. Here it is. And then I could put down a marker here, and I could note that this is Cambridge Common Park. This is, a meeting place for protests. And then I could note, for instance, that there's Black Lives Matter visibility here. Okay, and then one thing that happens as I draw these points of interest is that as I zoom out at any scale, that'll be visible. And when I mouse over it, I'll be able to see whatever the description was that gave that point its relevance that I'd like our line drawers to know about. Okay, so I hope you play around in this and see what it looks like to try to map your community. But I'll close this demo out by showing you what to do once you've made a map. So as Liz said earlier, there are lots of ways to share. So one is you can print these out, of course, and submit them on good old paper, if paper is a thing we do anymore. But another is to share electronically. We've tried to make that very easy. So if you go to that share button, you'll get a URL. And if you copy that URL, I should be able to show you. And I'll do this when I end my share. I can drop that in the chat, and then by clicking on that link, you can go into my map and use it as a starting point and maybe add to it or change the boundaries a little bit to make your own. And that's a way that, even though COVID has made us all pretty isolated and it's a lot harder to have a kind of in-person public meeting than it used to be, this is a way that you can still have a shared mapping experience, is by sending these maps around and building on the work of your friends and neighbors. Okay, and then one more thing I'll say, and this gets back to the question about official software and about how to make this visible for folks who are going to be drawing the lines. We have several different export options. So you can export these as what's called a JSON, which is a geospatial data format. You can export them as a spreadsheet, like basically readable as an Excel file if you want. And then we have a third option that's not quite debuted yet, but that's coming any moment, to export as a shape file. So that's the format that's native to software like Citygate. And that means that all the maps that are made through this community-driven COI mapping process can be made, can be exported in a form that the folks running Citygate will be able to see directly. All right, so that was my brief demo. Oh, and I wanted to send you the URL for the map that I made, just so you can see what it looks like to open up somebody else's map and contribute to it. Okay, Chris is asking, what is a shapefile versus a JSON? Those are just different file formats. They're different, like .json, different extensions at the end of the file name that are readable by different kinds of software. So folks like me who do a lot of data science with, for instance, Python and NetworkX, we'd be able to read a JSON, or folks who work in Pandas would be able to read a JSON. Folks who work in Citygate or Maptitude would be able to, or GIS software like ArcGIS would be able to read a shapefile. So they're just different file formats that can be read by different software. But we've worked really hard to make Districtr play nice with all the other software options that are out there, right? So the goal, I think, is, let 1,000 flowers bloom, right? People are going to be mapping the ways they're going to be mapping. They're even going to be crayon maps, like there always used to be, right? And we'll do the best job that we can towards kind of establishing best practices if we can take maps in as many formats as possible and fuse them and try to create some kind of, consensus or unity map like the one that Liz showed you earlier, that we can then ask the line drawers to preserve. And by doing that, we've taken what has always been a fairly vague desideratum, right? And we've operationalized it into something that can be upheld and measured, right? If we want to hold the line drawers accountable. All right, do folks have any other feedback or questions for us? So here's Chris. Chris says, let's say 100 individuals or groups create COI maps. What happens to them? Right, so that's the compilation process that I've been kind of gesturing at. So, this is something, again, that lots of folks can try to do. If there's a public data set, oh, and I should say this, right? So Districtr is, not only is it free to use, but the software is fully open source and public, right? So and so is the data that we collect. So all the maps that are made on Districtr will be available, but we collect no user information at all. There's no login. We don't collect anything about your keystrokes or your IP address or who you are. All we know is the maps that people make and share with the software. So what this creates is a data set of formidable size. And we've already had thousands of maps made all over the country just by word of mouth, right? So the question is, what can you do to fuse all of that at the end of the day? And so that's where we're talking to groups in the different states, and especially the commission states like Virginia, about producing a kind of consensus report made from these giant data sets, right? Without that, you risk being in the situation that you have so much information that you don't know what to do with it, right? And so the hope is that folks in the different states will work with data groups like ours to create a report that fuses all the input into something that's actionable. So Rob says, what state has best practices with COI work? Okay, great. I would point to the interesting process in California. I'll tell you how it works there. I'm not necessarily saying it's optimal, but they definitely put the greatest effort into taking COIs seriously in their line drawing process last time. Liz, if another example comes to mind for you, jump right in. Okay, so I'll briefly describe what happened in California. So in California, there was an independent commission seated in the last cycle. And there's also a really great public resource called the Statewide Database, run by a really cool woman named Corinne McDonald, who her office is based at UC Berkeley, and her job is to take all the state data that's relevant to the functions of the legislature and curate it in one place. So it happens that Karen's a real aficionado and is published on the subject of taking communities seriously. So she was contracted by the commission in the last cycle to be part of their COI collection process. The way they did it in California is they held an enormous number of in-person public meetings, and they made them fully transparent. They televised them all. And so what would happen is in these meetings, they'd ask folks to talk about their community, and then there'd be someone at the front of the room drawing it as they talked, right? And so the person in the audience would be like, no, move a little bit to the left, move a little bit to the north, don't include that street, right? And you'd get this kind of live drawn COI. The idea in California was the more transparent you could be about the process, the harder it would be to later call it cherry picked or biased, right? And so they went really far, and they even drew the lines live and televised, live streamed, kind of amazing. I think the only state that I know of that's ever tried to do that. And they were largely correct that being that public insulated them, but not from all criticism. So some of you may have seen pieces in the press that worried that COI input might have been kind of coordinated astroturf from different kinds of interest groups who were trying to sneak ideas into the record. For me personally, I would say the other issue that you might worry about for a process like that is that the loudest people in the room who speak up the first and kind of go on for the longest are going to have an outsized impact because all the line drawing is done live. And so I love what California did, and I think they were far and away the state to do the most robust COI consideration in the last cycle. But I would say this time around, the challenge is if you're not going to do it live, if you get some time to synthesize and deliberate, what does that let you do that you couldn't do in real time? And that's what I hope we've been able to at least sketch out for you tonight. Liz, you want to field another question or two?
Yeah, I was also going to add, I guess in line with the California example, another state isn't coming to mind, but I'm clicking around the Napa site for redistricting. They had a COI worksheet that really seemed to be taking COI seriously on a local level, which is something that's also great about building an open source database with Districtr. Those type of communities don't necessarily have to be used only in congressional or general assembly maps. They can be used in other districted elections. But this worksheet that I'm thinking of, asks for like rivers, roads, anything that could be a boundary for your community. So that's what came to mind.
Great. So Deb asked to talk about the sort of choices made in deciding where to draw lines. is a preference given to one group versus another when maps overlap? Well, actually there's also an interesting principle that came out of California. They called it share the pain. And so the way they you'd have all these different communities and you couldn't hold them all intact, right? So what can you do? So their principle was they were drawing maps for Congress, for the state Senate, and for the state House. And if you had to split a community in one of those maps, you would try extra hard not to split it in the other. That was share the pain, right? You may not be intact in all three, but at least you wouldn't be sacrificed in all three, right? So that's a kind of informal way to handle it. More formally, some splitting has to happen. This is true also for counties. So actually, this is a point that might be worth raising. We have already principles that say try not to split counties, try not to split cities, right? But to some extent, you have to split because some counties and cities are larger than a district. They have to be split, right? And so usually the guidance is to split them as little as practicable. So all I want to point out is that there already exist kind of scores for county integrity and city integrity. And once you have COIs actually presented to you with boundaries on a map, you can apply those same scores to COI splitting. So then you could ask of a proposed plan, well, what's its community integrity score, right? And that would give you a concrete way to compare proposed plans without having to sort of pick winners and losers among the different communities. But I don't want to, I'm a mathematician, I'm a data scientist, but I never want to make it sound like the end point of this process could be or should be to just hand everything over to computers and scores. I certainly don't believe that. I think districting at its best will always be a fundamentally human process that's about having the trade-offs in mind and thinking about the human consequences, right? So all of these different kinds of computationally enabled tools are there to help you do a better job, not to do the job for you. I think that's a really important high-level philosophy to have in mind. Okay, so Buzzy says, in Virginia, there's no overlap between House, Senate, and congressional districts. So most House seats fit only in one Senate seat, and most Senate seats fit into a congressional district. Yeah, there are 10 states in the US that actually require that House districts nest inside Senate districts completely, right? 8 of those states have 2-to-1 nesting, and 2 of them have 3-to-1 nesting. And there are other states that just say nest when possible, right? And that you'll see a whole lot of that in the world of redistricting, a whole lot of as much as practicable or whenever possible, right? And that's usually a flag that people who've actually done this work understand you can't accomplish 12 different things to perfection all at the same time. You have to have trade-offs and you have to have wiggle room in order to make a kind of human understandable map at the end of the day. Liz, you want to field a question or two?
Sure, yeah. So the next question is, can Districtr help identify when a drawn map is suboptimal? Does it essentially have a compare function that helps tell a story about why one map might be better than another? So in some modules, like Iowa, for example, we have a feature that'll tell you if your districts aren't contiguous, but it won't compare, the Districtr itself won't compare maps to tell you if one is better than the other.
So we do have some ways of doing comparative analysis in our lab, but it's not Districtr that does that for you. So we have a software suite called JerryChain, which uses a mathematical invention called Markov chains to try to build lots and lots of alternative maps. So for instance, Virginia is actually one of the states we've done a lot of studies of. So our software can build millions of Virginia maps that meet all the rules in a matter of seconds on a laptop, right? This isn't like high performance computing. This is really basic laptop computing. And in the last 5 years, a number of courts have found that kind of evidence persuasive when you're trying to evaluate a plan. So in other words, well, in particular, I was hired to consult for Tom Wolf, the governor of Pennsylvania, in the LWV versus Pennsylvania lawsuit in 2018, which in state court challenged the congressional plan in Pennsylvania as a partisan gerrymander, right? And there, what Governor Wolf asked me to do was just what I just described. He said, I know I'm going to be seeing new plans over the course of this litigation. And I would like an analytic framework to decide which are the good ones and which are the bad ones and which are the outliers and which ones are permissible and what, and so on. So there, what you can do is you can, by building this large ensemble of comparators, you can start to draw a story about what kinds of plans are partisan outliers and which ones are kind of in the fat part of the bell curve. And spoiler alert, Pennsylvania's proposed plans from the legislature clocked in as extreme outliers in a pro-Republican direction. This shouldn't be surprising. Everybody gerrymanders when they can. There's no news here, right? But what is new and exciting is that the science has kind of caught up with the problem in such a way that we can actually now see that not only are there a lot of seats for Republicans in these plans, but there's way more than are necessitated by the rules, right? That's the kind of argument you can start to develop. I'm happy to tell you more about that, but I just wanted to sketch. It's not Districtr that does that, but our lab does that kind of research all the time. Okay, Buzzy says, has any state except for Wyoming maybe achieved this? Which is this, Buzzy? I guess Wyoming's congressional plan is perfect. Is that what you had in mind? The whole
Can you hear
state
me?
being one district. Yeah.
Can you hear me now?
Mm-hmm.
That was a follow-up to my poorly typed question about nesting, and you answered it great. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thanks, Buzzy. Okay, the last question I see here is from Chris. Actually, there are House districts in Virginia that are split in different state Senate districts. Yeah, there's not a nesting requirement in Virginia. I didn't mean to say that there was. For example, here in Arlington, we have 4 delegates and 3 senators. In 2019, we had at least 8 different ballots with different combinations. By the way, this is something that's really good to use that comparison method that I just outlined on. Because whenever you see something like this, you should say, boy, that sounds bad. Is that unusual? And so a nice way to answer the question, is that suspicious? Is to compare to a batch of alternatives that meet all the rules. And that'll help you understand whether this anomaly that you're describing is kind of a consequence of the neutral rules in place, whether it's actually something that's maybe indicative of some sort of intent. That's how these kinds of ensemble techniques have been used in the past cycle in litigation. So yeah, maybe that's a good place to wind down, but I'll just say something I'm really excited about is the wider use of data science techniques, not just in litigation, but also up front when the plans are drawn. It's better to kind of have better line drawing in the first place than to challenge it in court after the fact. Although in reality, we'll probably have to do both. All right, so on that mixed optimistic and pessimistic note, it's been a pleasure talking to you tonight. I want to actually put some contact info for our team. So you can reach us at districtr@mggg.org. And you can reach me personally at mgchin. And Liz, are you Liz at MGGG?
Yeah, Liz at mggg.org.
Great.
I can type it in.
So this is some contact info for us, and we'd love to hear from you.
Thank you both so much for showing your tool and showing us the possibilities and how that can be used. Want everyone to know that this is recorded and that in January, we'll be sending out those dates. We already have them set up, but we will have some train the trainer sessions that will train you to use the tool to take it out into the community to help community organizers or particular communities draw themselves. And so we do want to be part of this mapping process as we go forward. So thank you all very much and have a great evening.
Thanks for joining.
Thank you.